Miles of paper moved through the recorder every day. Line after line, hour after hour, the chart rolled forward beneath a pen that translated radio signals from the sky into ink on paper. Most of it looked exactly as expected. Long stretches of routine traces, small fluctuations, familiar patterns. The kind of output that only becomes meaningful after patient inspection. This was not the dramatic side of astronomy. It was sorting, reviewing, looking through an overwhelming amount of ordinary information and trusting that, if something unusual existed, it would reveal itself through persistence rather than spectacle. Somewhere within those miles of chart paper, a graduate student named Jocelyn Bell Burnell noticed a small interruption. It was not large. It was not obvious. On a page crowded with routine markings, it appeared as a brief patch of scruff. A rough disturbance in an otherwise ordinary trace, the sort of thing that might be caused by interference, or equipment behavior, or any number of insignificant imperfections. The sensible explanation was that it meant nothing. The chart continued moving. More paper accumulated. More routine observations arrived. And then the scruff appeared again. Not in the same place on the paper. Not as a stain or defect. As a signal. A tiny disturbance embedded in another stretch of otherwise ordinary data. The first appearance could be ignored. The second demanded attention. The mark had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer simply present. It was recurring. At this stage, the explanation still seemed straightforward. Radio astronomy lived among sources of interference. Electrical equipment, transmissions, local disturbances, all could leave fingerprints on a recording. The scruff was small. The sky was noisy. Interference remained the most comfortable answer. Yet the chart recorder kept producing the same uncomfortable image. Another patch. Another disturbance. Another appearance. The important detail was not that it returned. It was how it returned. Random noise rarely develops habits. This did. The intervals began to suggest structure. The disturbance was behaving less like a mistake and more like something following instructions. That did not make it astronomical. It simply made it harder to dismiss. The paper charts continued arriving. Every new appearance placed additional pressure on the original explanation. If this was interference, why was it so disciplined? If this was equipment behavior, why did it arrive with such consistency? The anomaly was still small enough to overlook, but each return changed its meaning. A coincidence became a pattern. A pattern became a contradiction. The next step was not to invent extraordinary explanations. It was to look more closely at the evidence already present. The chart recorder could operate at a faster paper speed. Instead of compressing the disturbance into a brief patch of scruff, the faster motion would spread the signal across a greater distance of paper. The result transformed the mystery. The rough patch separated into individual pulses. Distinct. Regular. Repeated. The scruff had not disappeared. It had resolved. What previously looked like a blemish now looked like a sequence, a signal hidden inside the appearance of noise. The visual memory changed instantly. The audience of the chart recorder was no longer staring at a defect. They were staring at timing. Pulse. Pause. Pulse. Pause. Again and again. The regularity created a new problem. Natural radio sources were not expected to behave like precision clocks. Machines behaved this way. Transmitters behaved this way. The sky did not. At least, that was the assumption. And assumptions were beginning to experience the same fate as the interference explanation. One by one, they were failing. The signal remained. The explanations weakened. Checks followed. Comparisons followed. Attempts to connect the pulses to local sources followed. The process was not about proving a revolutionary discovery. It was about removing possibilities. Each possibility had to survive contact with the evidence. Many did not. If the source were local interference, certain patterns should appear. They did not. If the source were tied to activity on Earth, its timing should follow Earth-based expectations. It did not. The signal kept returning according to the sky. That distinction mattered enormously. A local source follows the clock on the wall. A celestial source follows the motion of the heavens. The pulse behaved like the second. That behavior created a contradiction difficult to escape. The signal possessed the precision of a machine. Yet it appeared to originate from a fixed position beyond Earth. The universe seemed to be acting like a clock. The remaining opportunities for dismissal began disappearing. Not dramatically, methodically. That is what made the process powerful. Nothing extraordinary was being added. Ordinary explanations were simply being removed. The chart paper kept moving. The pulses kept arriving. The evidence became increasingly stubborn. What began as a tiny visual disturbance had survived repeated encounters with skepticism. It had survived being called noise. It had survived being called interference. It had survived being called equipment behavior. The anomaly was proving more durable than the assumptions surrounding it. Eventually, the balance shifted. The burden no longer rested on proving the signal mattered. The burden rested on explaining why it continued to behave so consistently. The mark on the chart had earned its place as evidence. That change carried an important consequence. The discovery was not the result of a giant flash in the sky. Not an explosion. Not a dramatic image. It emerged from disciplined attention directed toward something most people would have ignored. The same patch of scruff that once looked insignificant now represented the first observed example of an entirely new astronomical phenomenon. The universe had been doing this all along. The signal had not changed. Only its meaning had. Look back at the opening image. Miles of chart paper, routine traces, an endless stream of ordinary observations. Inside that vast volume of information sat a tiny interruption. At first, it appeared to be the flaw, the thing that did not belong, the thing most likely to be erased by a better explanation. Instead, every better explanation disappeared first, and in the end, the chart recorders still showed the same recurring pattern, a small disturbance returning with impossible consistency from the sky. The blemish remained. The assumptions did not. What began as scruff on moving paper became the first trace of a pulsar, and the smallest mark on the page became the hardest thing in the universe to explain.